Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Pascal Boyer, the Henry Luce Professor of Individual and Collective Memory at Washington University in St. Louis. He teaches in the psychology and anthropology departments. The aim of the Luce program in individual and collective memory is to provide a forum where processes of individual and cultural memory can be studied as an integral field transcending disciplinary boundaries. Professor Boyer is an internationally recognized scholar on the study of how people and communities perceive and understand characteristics of their culture. One aspect of his research is aimed at describing neurocognitive systems that are part of the normal makeup of human minds as a result of evolution by natural selection and support the acquisition of cultural knowledge, concepts, and norms. Another aspect of Boyer's research focuses on the naturalness of religion. This cognitive framework was developed to account for the recurrent properties of religious concepts and norms in different cultures, which can be explained as a byproduct of standard cognitive architecture. Boyer aims to show how the organization of the human mind influences human cultures by making certain types of ideas or norms extremely easy to acquire and communicate. Professor Boyer is the author of 3 books, including Religion Explained, The Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought, as well as The Naturalness of Religious Ideas, A Cognitive Theory of Religion, which has been called a landmark study of religion and of cognitive approaches to culture. Other publications include an edited collection and more than 40 journal articles and book chapters. Professor Boyer visited the U of O on February 17, 2010, as a guest of the Center for Intercultural Dialogue. He gave a lecture entitled Mental Instincts and Their Effects on Religious Thought and Behavior. Pascal, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming to speak with us. I'm going to start with a really big question, and you can tell me if you want to change that and make it a smaller one instead. But the first question I had for you is, why is there some kind of religion in all human cultures?
All right, change the question, please.
All right, let's change it.
Let's try that one. That one is the answer to that one would be would take a very long time and probably would take a whole career to solve. So it's true that there is some kind of religion in all human societies that we've documented, and it's also true that it goes as far back as we can document, in the sense that even Neanderthals, for example, seem to have done things that we would think are religious, like burying your dead with, decoration and things like that, in what seems to be a ritualized way. So we have that, and why do we have that everywhere? The first thing to notice that we don't have it in very much the same way everywhere, and that lots of things that we think are religion and have to be in religion are actually not that frequent around the world. One thing that I always try to tell people, to start with, because it's very important, is that concern for the afterlife, the sanction for one's good or bad deeds in one's life, the origin of the world, the question whether there's a creator in the world. All these are questions that are actually not present in that many human cultures. So we have religion in the sense of having something we can talk about a bit more in a minute that looks like religious, but it's very different from what we are used to in the West. It can be very different, and it's often not in the form of a doctrine or a very explicit set of ideas. It's more in a set of presuppositions that people have about the way the world is, what's around.
So first of all, the question I asked you was to ask you to summarize your entire life's work, which was an unfair place to start. But beyond that, it might lead us to the next question, which is how we define what we mean by religion.
That's right, and it's pretty difficult to do that because most of the definitions we have are based on what we're familiar with. What we're familiar with is, in general, world religions, literate religions where there are scriptures, priests, an establishment, if you want. Where there is a notion of commitment, of being a member of a religion. Now, it's pretty clear that what we had for millennia was more of a tribal kind of set of religious ideas and behaviors, where there is no doctrine that is very explicit. There are no priests, there are no institutions. No one would think that you have to be a member of the local religion. There are ghosts, ancestors, spirits, gods, whatever, but they're there. It would make no sense to say that you're a member of a religion. You would just deal with the stuff that's there, and that stuff includes ghosts, gods, all sorts of things like that. So how do we define it? Well, we define it by people's belief and commitment to the idea that there are non-physical human agents around them. That's a lot of jargon to say that basically the idea of a spirit or a god is what is the signal of religion. But it's very important to think that to realize that this very often means a whole variety of agents that are around, that people think are around, that are not physically present or very easy to detect, but are very important in people's lives because they bring about misfortune, but also good fortune, and they can be a source of help, but also of danger. So that's what we have. That's what we find in lots of different places.
If I understood you correctly, one of the precepts that we need to give up on in order to understand this is a sort of religion where one chooses one's denomination or chooses to ally with it or not. You're talking about structures that exist in the kind of world understanding of people in different cultures.
That's right, and there's no sense of choosing the worldview in that sense because you don't really choose to be a believer in the existence of chairs, buses, tables, and things like that. Where in the same way, lots of people in most tribal societies would tell you, well, there are spirits around. It's not a choice of believing in them. You just have to deal with them, to interact with them.
Could you give an example or two?
Yes, well, I can give you examples of that from places where I did field work, where I studied the local religious system, and particularly in Cameroon, where I did lots of studies of people's religious ideas. And over there, I would say that the most important agents that are interacting with people are their ancestors, which means dead people, but dead people who are sort of become anonymous, a sort of mass of, our forebears. It's a bit like the founding fathers here, it's like, we can invoke them, we can have connection with them. They wanted us to do this and that, and they're conveniently dead, so they can't, answer back to what people say. And a whole variety of sort of bad, evil spirits that are sort of, roam around and annoy people in all sorts of ways. Now, these entities are not terribly important in people's lives in the sense of what we'd call religious commitment. No one thinks about them in terms of commitment. But when people are sick, when their crops are not doing quite as well as they expected, when anything turns out bad, or if things turn out too well for some people, then people start to think, well, there's some sort of agency there. The spirits must be in on this one, or the ancestors are punishing this person for not doing something, for not giving them sacrifices or things like that. So that's the way it interacts in people, but in people's lives. But one thing that you will never encounter in places of that kind is people telling you that this is what explains the origin of evil, or the origin of the world, or why the world is the way it is, or things like that. And I think those concerns are concerns that you have once you have a sort of priesthood whose job it is to, as it were, create those questions and then give the answers. Absent that kind of institution, people are not terribly interested in those questions. I remember trying to, as a sort of experiment, trying to get people into metaphysical discussions about the origin of evil, and the answer was basically that either that people are bad or stuff happens. So there was no religious dimension to that. But on the other hand, if the notion of me having to deal with some misfortune, then people would say, well, that's the ancestors. The existence of misfortune in general is not a big problem. It's why does it affect me and not another person? Why am I less lucky than another individual? So that's the way in which it appears and I think that's the way in which it appeared from a very long time before we had religious institutions, really.
You mentioned trying to engage people in metaphysical conversations, yes. And that touches on something I wanted to ask you about your methodology, your methods in the field. How do you gather what you need to understand this?
That's another very important question that in anthropology we used to have this idea that, well, the only methodology basically is to ask people. And since most people are not interested in answering those questions, and if you go around in Eugene today and ask people what's the origin of the world, or do you think there's, you won't get, people will look at you a bit as you're a bit odd or something. But so the idea was, well, we have to find good informants who are people who are the local intellectuals, if you want, who've thought about these things. Now, in the last sort of 20, 30 years, people who work on religion have started doing something completely different, which is to run psychology experiments. And the point of that is to have access to not just to people's explicit notions about their gods, ancestors, or things like that, but also to the tacit, unconscious premises, if you want, that they have, that they use when they're thinking about those. I don't know if you want an example of that sort of thing.
I'd love an example, yes, please.
A good example is research done by a colleague of mine called Justin Barrett in Michigan, where he did that research with Christians in Michigan and wanted to document to what extent are they aware of the way they think about God. So a typical sort of kind of experiment he had was to ask them, what is God like? What makes God different from people? And he got all sorts of answers, and the sort of modal answer, the most frequent answer, was that God can attend to everything at the same time. God has this sort of supernatural mental power that he attends to everything at the same time. Now, then Justin had all sorts of techniques to elicit people's response without them sort of realizing that they're actually talking about that. So, for example, he gave them the stories of a story of God attending to two events at the same time, attending to a man drowning in a river and a lady who'd misplaced her purse or something like that. And then just asked them to recall the story. And you could see that in a recall, people, when they were not actually on the spot actually and trying to define what God is, when people recall the stories, they said that God did this and then he turned his attention to something else. And what's interesting about that kind of story is that it shows that people are not really thinking of God as attending to everything at the same time. They're thinking of him as attending to one thing after another, just like a human person would do. And Justin Barrett called that effect the theological correctness effect. People try to be theologically correct by saying, well, what I think about God is this, this, and that. And then they have conversations with God as if that was, a normal person. We did that in other places. Justin did it in India. I did those studies in Africa too, where you ask people what can spirits see in the dark, and people tell you, well, yes, they can see in the dark, of course, because they're sort of supernatural. They can see and do all sorts of things like that. But then if you tell them in a story that something happened and the spirit didn't see because it was too dark, they find that perfectly normal. So the tacit assumption, the one that's really working inside their mind, is that it's really like a little person. So there's an explicit sort of conviction that, yes, we have metaphysical beliefs that make the gods very different from us. In practice, there's lots of anthropomorphism in there. So we've been doing lots of experimental research like that, trying to see what people recall, how they reason about those things. And it's interesting because it shows that generally people are not aware of the way they think about those things. And we like to say, well, people don't believe what they believe they believe. That's the, they believe certain things about God, but actually they don't believe them. They believe something much simpler, much more human-like very often.
So to peel back here, first of all, I'm understanding the interdisciplinary nature of your inquiries much better after hearing you mention cognitive psychology, clinical psychology, experimental psychology, anthropology, theology, all those things together. But I'm curious if you could step back for a moment and go back to try to explain what it is in the human makeup that leads us to have some kind of belief that one might call religious.
There is one problem about that question, which is that it assumes that there's one answer. That is, there is one thing that may make us have those ideas. So Freud used to think that certainly, our early relationship to our fathers would be the source of religious notions. Or other people might think that it's class relations or things like that. What seems to emerge from the kind of research that we do on these things is that it's not quite like that. It's more like a market phenomenon. When a company is successful, it's not because it treats its employees well. It's not because it treats its customers well. It's not because it does it makes good quality stuff. It's because it does all those things. So the reason why religious ideas are widespread is not that they titillate or satisfy one little system in the mind. It's rather that they do it to all sorts of different systems. And therefore, there is no sort of single reason why these things are successful where we have them. There's rather a sort of multiplicity of mental systems that seem to find those ideas at least worth entertaining, talking about, communicating to others. And, so there is a sort of catalogue of things that are important for religion. One of them is just this notion of having more agents in the world than there seems. So we create fiction. We get moved by fiction. We fall in love with fictional heroes and heroines and people like that. We're used to thinking about dead people as if they were around to judge us. It's a perfectly reasonable thing for a human being to say that I'm ashamed of what I did because my father, who's been dead for 10 years, what would he think of that? If you're a pure materialist, you would say, no, this is an absurd statement. He's dead, he cannot think. But to all of us, it's perfectly natural. So the idea is that humans are very good at interacting with agents that are not around. Marjorie Taylor here at Oregon does lots of research on children and their imaginary friends, and she shows that children with their imaginary friends are interacting with a real person, in the sense that it's a person that's complex, that they have a rich interaction with. It's not just a little fantasy. So we're good at that. And if you have a doctrine that says that, those non-physical agents are around and they matter and they're interested in what's happening to you, they have a stake in your existence, that's the kind of idea that we find appealing, intuitively appealing, and which explains things in our environment at a low cost, because we already do that anyway, all the time. That's one. Let me take another example. We have lots of ideas of contagion, contamination, and purification in our everyday life. In all societies in the world, people have ideas about contagion, about dirty stuff, about how to wash themselves and stuff like that, cleanse their bodies, etc. Now, religions tell you, there's that in a sort of invisible realm as well. You have, religious blasphemy makes you impure. You have to purify yourself. You have to go through rituals to be cleansed of your sins. All these things speak to a little corner of our mind. I could go on, but the idea is that for many aspects of religion, they happen to be optimal for certain systems that we had anyway. And therefore, they're what we like to call good to think for human minds. They are low cost, as it were. There's not much effort in entertaining them, but also they're high. We call that high inferential potential. That is just jargon for saying once you have them, you can generate lots of explanations for things around you, or at least lots of comments on things around you. So given those features, it would be surprising if human minds didn't actually catch these ideas, and because they're catchy for us, and retain them. So in a way, we're not saying there's an instinct for religion in human minds. We're saying, no, there's just lots of dispositions for things that sound like religion, and nothing sounds like religion better than religion. So that's where we are at the moment.
That was a great answer to the complexity of
Yeah.
why religious beliefs appeal to us. Is it also simplistic to ask from the neurobiological point of view whether there's a particular piece of the brain that gets involved in this?
Yes, it's very likely that a good many neural systems are involved in those things, simply because gods and spirits are persons. We have lots of systems that are there to interpret what persons are like and what our interaction is like with them. Gods and spirits are sometimes terrifying, and we have brain systems to handle fear of potential danger. Gods and spirits are also for us against the other guys, and we have brain systems to manage coalitions and conflict with others. So yes, the God bit of the brain is pretty much the brain. So I don't think we'll find the little lobe or bit of gyrus where it's located. It has to be everywhere, yeah.
That's a great phrase. The God bit of the brain is the brain. Well, let me shift the topic just a little bit. You have another very catchy quotation, which is that atheism will always be a harder sell than religion. Could you explain that one?
Yes, it may seem a bit special, and you know, I was brought up in a culture where no one is religious, and where no one educated in particular is religious. It's completely sort of exotic. So of course, for me, it would seem that being a-religious, which doesn't mean really what atheism is like. I mean, people think of people who are against religion, but it's just a sort of indifference to religion. In most of Western Europe, for many, decades or maybe centuries now, it's been the sort of default mode. People are not terribly interested. But I'm saying that, on the whole, if you look at the history of human societies, you have to realize that this kind of indifference to gods, spirits, and ancestors is pretty rare. And also that it only appears in places where there is a conflict against religion. For example, the most atheistic places in the world are places where there's been a lot of conflict with established churches. So where the church is seen as a sort of social oppression mechanism. So if you remove all these things, you realize that on the whole, what's not terribly easy to sell about atheism is a set of propositions like some terrible misfortune happened to you. It might have happened to someone else, but it happened to you. And the reason for that is, well, there is no reason. That's it. Or some people get, all the benefits from social life, some people don't. There are social reasons for that, but there's nothing else than social reasons for that. There's no meaning there. There's no purpose. Or if you say nature is around the way it is, but there's absolutely no purposive, agent behind it. These are propositions that take more effort to entertain, simply because they remove something that is very natural for us, which is to say, if there is some big effect, there must be some big cause, and also if there's a big effect in nature or in the world, the best cause would be an agent who wanted that effect to be around. I do some developmental studies with young children, and I know that, actually that's a good tip for parents of young children who are always bothering them with questions like why, So Cinderella went back to the castle. Why? Because she wanted to see the prince. Why? Because she wanted to get married. Why? And they go on so for him. Usually you can stop that by just saying that's because she wanted it to be that way. And in the same way, why do we have blue eyes? Because we're born that way. Why we're born that way? Children can go on forever like that. You can stop that by putting an agent in the story at some point. And if you say God wanted us to be like that, they say, okay, that's end of the story. And I think it's true for adults too. I mean, the idea that there's more agents or agency in the world than it seems is a very powerful one. If you are an atheist or if you're a materialist, you say, well, there's less agency in the world than there seems. Even societies are not really like agents. They're bundles of people and there's no real agent there. There's just millions of agents together. It's a complex system. It's not an agent. I think people don't find that worldview terribly appealing because it doesn't explain much and it's pretty difficult to think about. Try to think of what's happening in the US without thinking of pseudo-agents, like the government wants to do this. The Senate will remember that. All these, which are literally absurd because Senate doesn't have a brain or, we want to have those concepts. We need them. So if you're an atheist, you're basically saying to people, well, no, there's no such thing. Try to think without those things. I think that's a very hard sell. Yeah.
It's useful to hear that as a product in some ways of our contemporary society, I think. We are going to have to close there. I'm sorry to say that we are already out of time. I would have loved to have heard a whole lot more from you, including how religious fundamentalists view your work, but we'll leave that for the next interview, perhaps.
If I'm still alive.
We hope so. Thank you for coming to talk to us.
Oh, thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Pascal Boyer, Henry Luce Professor of Individual and Collective Memory at Washington University in St. Louis. He gave a lecture entitled Mental Instincts and Their Effects on Religious Thought and Behavior at the U of O on February 17th, 2010. Thanks very much for watching.